Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to our first class in our course on the Johannine literature, and you can see today we are on a beautiful mountaintop. This is in central Utah. I choose this location because it's the perfect place for us to discuss these first 18 verses of John's Gospel, the Prologue, which reference the very dawn of creation and the still greater splendor of what God's going to do anew with the coming of Jesus Christ into the world. I want us to look at the whole of John's Gospel. Let's first do this synchronic survey. Remember, a synchronic survey is a study of the whole text in its final form. It contrasts with a diachronic survey, which looks to see how the text evolved over time. Anyway, this synchronic survey of John's Gospel. Almost all scholars would agree on some version of this outline. You have the prologue, you have the book of signs, you have the book of glory, which take up the meat and potatoes of the entire gospel, and then you have chapters 20 and 21, which are the epilogue, the post-resurrection accounts. So what we're going to talk about today is the prologue, but then we're going to be looking at the book of signs and book of glory for most of the course. The book of signs is so called because we have these 7 miracle stories that are called signs, and you can see I've got them listed there for you. And then the book of glory. The book of glory, that word glory refers to Christ's death and resurrection, but especially his passion. So it's an ironic use of the term glory. It's calling glorious the very thing that people of Jesus' time would not think of as glorious. So anyway, let's look now at the prologue, and we're going to proceed in an unusual order. We're not going to go from very beginning to very end. Instead, I'd like us to look at this mirror structure of the entire letter, what this author calls a parabola. The first 11 verses refer to God's descent, coming into the world. And then the last bit of the canticle refers to the ascending, how we have come to perceive, come to know God's glory. That's going to be very important. Those verbs of perception are going to be very important in our study of John's Gospel because so much of the Gospel is focused on giving testimony. We emphasized that in the welcome video. Testimony, a crucial motif in John's Gospel, along with all of the other courtroom language. So we're going to proceed from outside to inside. We're going to start with the very beginning and the very end, and then we're going to proceed towards the center. We look at the beginning and end. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And then it continues at the very end to say, no one has ever seen God. The only Son, God, who is at the Father's side, has revealed him. I want to point out that the translation of that last verse, verse 18, is difficult. A lot of scholars disagree on how we should translate it, just grammatically, and also there are some text critical difficulties in that verse. So we can just look at this slide and we can see the emphasis on creation. In the beginning, a clear allusion to the creation story in Genesis. I want to also point out, besides the theological complexity of the Word's relationship to the Father, of course, Trinitarian theologians have been arguing about this, as have Christologists for centuries, emphasize that last verb, has revealed him. That verb revealed is the Greek word that gives us the word exegesis. So literally, the Son, the Word, has exegeted the Father. He has made him known. He has made it possible for us to understand who God is. That brings us to our next few stages in John 1:3 through 5. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Again, as we talked about earlier, this is a reference to the original creation, day 1 of creation, where light is separated from darkness. Later on in the canticle, we're going to hear about what is new. From his fullness, from Christ's fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace, because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. We spoke in the welcome video about how here Moses and Jesus are contrasted, and even more fundamentally, here in this last part, it's talking about what is new with the coming of Jesus. Now, I want to show you another passage, this from 2 Corinthians, where St. Paul says something very similar to what we're reading in John. In the Pauline letter, the apostle says, "For God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to bring to light the knowledge of the glory of God on the face of Jesus Christ." And then he'll continue in the next chapter to say, "Whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come." That term, New creation does not appear in John's gospel. But this emphasis on creation creates a parallel between what St. Paul wrote in the 50s and what John is writing most likely in the 90s, a generation or so later. And I don't think this is a coincidence. Indeed, we know that 1 Corinthians was written in Ephesus. Paul had spent a couple years there. And then he wrote 2 Corinthians soon after leaving Ephesus. It's distinctly possible that the language that we're seeing in John's Gospel, which we think was also written in Ephesus, at least that's the traditional position, with much to commend to it, that this same theology that was preached once by Paul has now been appropriated in the fourth Gospel. It's an interesting and compelling parallel. We can't ever prove it, but it's at least worth considering and worth exploring. Anyhow, this now brings us to the next section within the canticle, which refers to John the Baptist giving testimony. We're going to have a chance to talk about this in greater detail when we look at the rest of chapter 1, so I'm not going to say more about it right now. But again, testimony. One is able to give testimony only when one has perceived something. Just as I can only go into court and testify at the witness stand if I have actually seen or heard something. I've perceived something through my natural faculties. The same is true for John and others who testify to the Lord. They have to see. So in light of that, pun intended, let us proceed to this next part. We pick up with verse 9. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him. And we'll hear a little bit more later. But then the famous verse 14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we saw his glory. The glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The most important thing to note in this section is that perception is taking place. The light, which enlightens everyone, enlightenment makes it possible for human beings to perceive. And then with the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, we indeed did perceive. We saw his glory. But that sets up the essential conflict of the entire gospel, the centerpiece of this canticle, verses 10b through 13. But the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not by natural generation, nor by a human choice, nor by a man's decision, but of God. This is the essential conflict. Just as we saw when we looked at the Corinthian letters in our Pauline course, there are two kinds of people for St. Paul: the perishing and those who are being saved. And one has to belong to one team or the other. There's no compromise possible. The same thing is true here in John's Gospel. One either receives this enlightenment, one sees the Lord's glory, one perceives and so accepts, or one does not accept. You can see on your slide here we have green and red. You want to be on the green team. That's the point that John is making. We already talked about in our welcome video about how John tells us exactly why he writes this gospel, so that you, the reader, may come to believe. This is his first foray into making his case, of offering his own testimony so that we might be able to also offer testimony to Christ, the Word made flesh. There's much more to come. Until we meet again, read well and pray well.